It now gives me great honor and pleasure to introduce a man of God, a biblical scholar, and arguably one of the greatest orators of our generation. He is a gifted, anointed, dynamic pastor of the historic Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. He is the 8th pastor to be installed in its 213-year history. A committed pastor to causes beyond the church. As a result, Alfred Street is one of the first and only faith-based organizations that I know to date that has donated $1 million for the building of the African American Museum across the mall. Please give him a round of applause for that. Like Dr. King, he is a man of passion. That passion for those less fortunate. The passion that led Alfred Street to purchase property adjacent to the church for affordable housing in the historic Old Town Alexandria. In 1994, magna cum laude graduate of Duke University, one of your guys over here, he left medical school after yielding to God's calling to attend seminary in preparation for serving God's people. He attended Boston University School of Theology, where he was a Martin Luther King Jr. scholar and a 97 summa cum laude graduate concentrating on Bible studies and African American religions. Please join me in welcoming Pastor Howard John Wesley.
Thank you, Brother Johnson, and to Mr. Vickers, the entire board, to Secretary Zinke, and all you who are gathered here in this place tonight. Let me move quickly and begin by expressing the humbling honor that is mine to stand and share this occasion as we remember not only the life, but more particularly the death of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1994, I was matriculating into Princeton Theological Seminary when Boston University called 1 week after class began, offering me the opportunity to become a Martin Luther King scholar. It was an offer I couldn't turn down, not simply because it came with a full tuition scholarship, but even more so, it afforded me the honor to study the life, the works, and the speeches of one of the greatest prophets of justice and humanity. I always consider it an honor to share my reflections on the life of Dr. King for several reasons. One being that history has a way of characterizing great women and men. The farther time takes us away from them, the more distorted their real portrait becomes. We wind up seeing a black and white portrait that is void of all the colorful details that make their lives authentic. From a distance, even the ugliest person looks good. Many of my children's generation will learn and love that pleasant portrait of Dr. King. They'll learn about him in February, and they'll learn to recite a few lines of I Have a Dream, and they'll limit his life and his message to those words that were spoken. If today was January 15th, and we were celebrating his birth, maybe I too would stand in this place and try to paint for you a pleasant portrait of Dr. King. Maybe I'd stand before you and share my version of I Have a Dream, and quote to you about the dream that one day the sons and daughters of former slaves will be able to sit down at the table of brotherhood with the sons and daughters of former slave owners. But with authenticity to this day and to his assassination, I would rather not talk about the I Have a Dream Dr. King, but rather the man that the FBI Domestic Intelligence Division once called the most dangerous Negro in America. Why was Dr. King killed? 49 years ago today at 6:01 p.m., outside of room 309 of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated by James Earl Ray. But if you study his life, you know that his public death and demise began long before that bullet was ever fired. If you step back and look at Dr. King, a Cliff Note version of his life will show that you see two personas. There's the king who preached and proclaimed justice from 1954 to 1965. But then in 1966, until the end of his life in 1968, Dr. King made a radical and dangerous shift in his philosophy and his approach that caused him to both lose popularity within the American populace and support among his own people. 49 years ago today, that shot was fired. For those who know the history of Dr. King know that 50 years ago today, on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King set in motion events that would ultimately lead to his assassination when he mounted the pulpit and the national platform of the Riverside Church in New York and delivered his sermon, Beyond Vietnam. That sermon epitomized the shift that set in motion the events that bring us to this memorial today. In that sermon, Dr. King, against the advice of his personal advisors and those closest to him, felt compelled to address America's violence in Vietnam. He could no longer sustain the idealism and the optimism that molded the I Have a Dream speech on the Mall. He stood at that platform not as one speaking with a national consciousness, but rather with an awareness of his global citizenship. And in that speech, Beyond Vietnam, he charged America with being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He questioned our nation's commitment to democracy and freedom if we only fought for it when it served the interest of American investments overseas. He unveiled the hypocrisy of spending millions of dollars in a war when there was abject poverty in every urban environment right here at home. He questioned his own commitment to nonviolence in the face of an American government that wielded its violence with impunity. He objected to sending poor people overseas to fight a war only to return home to more poverty. He exposed the evil of American capitalism by placing profits ahead of people. And he recognized that racism in America had two twin siblings that we had not addressed: militarism and materialism. And Dr. King suggested that America could not change until all three, racism, militarism, and materialism, were all challenged and changed. Dr. King did not stop there with the call for withdrawal of our troops from Vietnam. If he had, maybe we wouldn't be here today. But Dr. King took one step further, and for many it was one step too far, when he suggested that our presence in Vietnam revealed a fundamental flaw in the morality of America. He suggested that we are a nation who was morally corrupt. And it was that unveiling and exposing of the internal corruption and hypocrisy of American politics that ultimately led Dr. King to be hated. Beloved, I stand tonight to tell you that moral corruption still exists. There is something morally corrupt about having billions of dollars for war and yet cutting back free lunches in school. There's something morally corrupt about monetizing the incarceration of black and brown bodies. There's something morally corrupt about defending my life from terrorists, but allowing me to die from a pre-existing medical condition that doesn't allow me to get health care. There is something morally corrupt about having lots to say about who's marrying whom and nothing to say about the number of dead black bodies in the streets from gun violence. That we still deal with a moral corruption. The response to Dr. King's sermon in New York that day were swift and severe. Criticism and controversy abounded. The Washington Post wrote and said that he should never be respected again. That Dr. King had moved from a progressive dream to an unsupported fantasy. Black journalist Carl Rowan wrote that Dr. King spoke with very little sense and no tactical skill. Internally, Dr. King lost the support of some great voices in the civil rights movement: James Farmer, Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young, and even Jackie Robinson. The NAACP passed a resolution denouncing King's declarations in his speech in Riverside. Many began to call him Martin Loser King. It was said that when President Johnson read the news report of King's speech, He was not only incensed, but he became hostile, feeling like he had been betrayed by Dr. King. J. Edgar Hoover once wrote, "It is clear that King was an instrument in the hands of subversive forces seeking to undermine the nation." Subsequent to his Vietnam sermon, and believing that poverty was the greatest ill and evil in America, Dr. King launched the Poor People's Campaign. And in that campaign, he planned to bring poor people to Washington to shut business down. Then move that same campaign to New York to shut Wall Street down. Then to go to New York and London and Johannesburg and all major cities, gathering poor people from around the land to shut the cities down. It was historian Stephen Oates in his book, Let the Trumpet Sound, who made note that after King's sermon and the launching of the Poor People's Campaign, that right-winged businessmen saw King as a black devil who threatened free enterprise, white supremacy, and their own personal wealth. Contracts from Southern business owners ranging as high as $50,000 for anyone who would, in the words of John Kaufman, a motel owner in the South and known Klansman, said, "We will pay for anyone who will kill the big." Dr. King was always aware of threats against his life from the first time his house was bombed in January of 1954. But the threats that came after his speech on Vietnam and the launching of the Poor People's Campaign weighed more heavily on him. One staffer even said that the strain of wondering when it would come was almost overpowering to Dr. King. Dr. King knew that his comments about the war, the Poor People's Campaign, and exposing the moral corruption of America increased his chances of being killed. And you could almost hear it in his speech delivered 49 years and 1 day ago today, as he stood at the Mason Temple Church of God in Christ in Memphis, speaking about the sanitation workers going on strike, giving normal comments about race relations. Towards the end of that speech, Dr. King went off script and began to share in an ominous way his understanding that his life was about to come to an end. He says at the end of that speech, "I don't know what's going to happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. And like anyone, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But none of that matters right now. All I want to do is God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountaintop. And I've peered over and I've seen the promised land." And then, with almost tears running down his eyes and the realization that his life might end, he said, "And I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight as a people that we will get there. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And in fashion to Dr. King, he ended that speech quoting from one of the great hymns of the Christian church, the battle hymn of the Republic. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." And in the final verse of that hymn, he says, "In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the seas, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us live to make men free." Those last refrains speak to what I believe Dr. King would have wanted on this day, for us to make sure that what he died for, we live for. That the cause of his death will be the cause of our struggle. That we would continue that journey to the promised land, where we are not only equal, but we are all employed. Where we're not only free, but where we are all fed. Where we not only matter, but we all have medical coverage. Where we not only have the right to vote, but we also have the right to live. For what does it mean to be able to vote if one cannot breathe? We will get to that promised land, and we continue on in the struggle of Dr. Martin Luther King, that we might too lift our voices one day and declare, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Thank you.